there's a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't break dishes, slam doors, or post angry messages online. It stays quiet, invisible, almost polite. And that's exactly why most people never see it coming. They think everything is fine because the empath in their life still smiles, still listens, still forgives. But what they don't understand is this: empaths don't leave when they're angry. They leave when they're emotionally exhausted. And by the time they finally walk away, they've already mourned the relationship in silence 100 times. The scary part? Most people never realize the damage they caused until the empath is completely gone. No argument, no revenge, no dramatic goodbye, just distance, cold silence, a slow disappearance that feels permanent. Because once an empath reaches that point, something inside them changes forever. And here's the twist most people don't expect: the empath usually gave more chances than anyone else ever would. They tolerated behavior that secretly destroyed them emotionally, hoping love, patience, and understanding would eventually fix it. But there's one specific thing that cuts deeper than betrayal itself. One behavior that makes Eve, or most compassionate person, emotionally detach without warning. And when you understand what that is, you'll never look at human relationships the same way again. Because the people who care the deepest are often the ones silently suffering the most. An empath has a dangerous habit. They see the good in people long after everyone else has walked away. They'll defend someone who hurt them. They'll make excuses for toxic behavior. They'll tell themselves, maybe they're just stressed. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe if I love them harder, they'll finally change. And that's exactly why empaths end up trapped in relationships that slowly drain their soul. The truth is, empaths don't fall in love casually. They connect deeply, emotionally, psychologically. They don't just hear your words, they absorb your energy. They notice the tiny shifts in your voice, your mood, your silence. They can feel when something is wrong before you even say it. And because they understand pain so well, they become extremely patient with broken people. But patience has a limit. What destroys an empath isn't conflict, it's emotional inconsistency. Mixed signals. Being loved one day and emotion, or DA, ignored the next. Being valued only when convenient. Being treated like an emotional safe place while their own emotional needs are neglected. That confusion slowly poisons them from the inside. At first they try harder. They communicate calmly. They explain how they feel. They give endless chances because they genuinely believe people can heal. But every time their vulnerability gets dismissed, something inside them starts shutting down. Quietly, slowly, invisibly. And most people miss the warning signs. Because empaths don't always explode when they're hurt. Sometimes they become quieter, more distant, less expressive. They stop explaining themselves. They stop begging to be understood. They stop reacting. And ironically, that's when the relationship is already dying. See, the final stage of an empath isn't anger. It's emotional detachment. And once they emotionally detach, it's almost impossible to bring them back. What makes this terrifying is how calm they seem during the process. No dramatic scenes, no emotional chaos, just silence, a different energy, a version of them that no longer reaches out first, no longer checks in constantly, no longer tries to fix thin or given. That's because they've finally realized something painful. They were fighting for a connection that the other person only enjoyed benefiting from. There's a psychological reason this hurts empaths so deeply. Their identity is often tied to emotional reciprocity. They naturally pour energy into people they love. So when they continuously give empathy but receive emotional neglect in return, their nervous system starts experiencing emotional burnout. And emotional burnout is dangerous. Because unlike temporary sadness, burnout changes how a person connects forever. The empath starts questioning themselves. Am I asking for too much? Am I too sensitive? Maybe I should stay quiet. They shrink themselves emotionally just to keep the relationship alive. They become less expressive, less needy, less honest about their pain, until eventually they don't recognize themselves anymore. That's the breaking point. Not the betrayal, not the argument, not even the disrespect. The breaking point is realizing they abandoned themselves trying to keep someone else comfortable. And once an empath sees that truth clearly, something shifts permanently. Suddenly, the same person they were once chased emotionally no longer affects them the same way. The attachment weakens. The emotional dependency dissolves. They stop romanticizing potential and start seeing reality. That transformation shocks people. Because the empath who once tolerated everything suddenly becomes unreachable. No explanation, no revenge, no emotional speech, just absence. And the people who took them for granted usually react too late. That's when the texts start coming. The apologies, the sudden emotional awareness, the promises to change. But what most people fail to understand is this: empaths don't leave impulsively. They leave after surviving months or years of emotional loneliness beside someone who claimed to love them. By the time they disappear, they've already spent countless nights overthinking everything, replaying conversations, blaming themselves, hoping things would improve. Their leaving isn't spontaneous. It's the final result of emotional exhaustion. And emotionally exhausted people don't always come back, especially when they finally experience peace after leaving. That's the part nobody talks about. When empaths finally detach from toxic emotional patterns, they feel guilty at first. They wonder if they gave up too soon. They miss the memories, the connection, the familiar routines. But then something strange happens. Their nervous system calms down. They sleep better, think clearer, feel lighter. And for the first time in a long time, they realize how much stress they normalized while trying to save someone else emotionally. That realization changes everything. Because once peace becomes stronger than attachment, the relationship loses its power over them. People often mistake empathy for weakness. But real empathy is incredibly dangerous when pushed too far. Because empaths observe everything. They remember patterns. They notice emotional manipulation long before they admit it to themselves. And when they finally stop ignoring those patterns, they detach with complete certainty. That certainty is what makes their disappearance feel permanent. No matter how deeply they love someone, once trust emotionally collapses inside them, rebuilding it feels unnatural. Their brain starts associating the relationship with emotional danger instead of emotional safety. And humans naturally avoid what emotionally exhausts them, especially for sensitive people. One of the most painful things you can do to an empath is make them feel emotionally invisible, to constantly receive their support while ignoring their emotional reality, to only value them when you need comfort, validation, attention, or healing. Because eventually, the empath realizes they were loved more for what they provided than for who they actually were. That realization destroys attachment instantly, and this happens more often than people think. Some people become addicted to the emotional safety empaths provide. They love being understood without judgment. They love having someone patient enough to absorb their chaos. But they rarely ask themselves a difficult question: am I emotionally caring for the person who keeps emotionally caring for me? That imbalance silently kills relationships, because empaths don't need perfection. They need emotional honesty, consistency, reciprocity. They need to feel emotionally safe enough to be vulnerable without being punished for it later. The problem is, many people only appreciate an empath after losing them. Why? Because empaths make emotional labor look effortless. They remember the small details. Tea or hey check on people. They notice mood changes. They give reassurance naturally. They create emotional warmth so consistently that others start taking it for granted, until it disappears. And when it disappears, the emotional emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly, nobody listens the same way. Nobody understands the silence the same way. Nobody makes them feel emotionally seen the same way. That's when regret begins. But regret doesn't always rebuild connection, especially when the empath finally chooses themselves. There's another psychological truth most people don't realize. Empaths often stay longer than they should because they become emotionally attached to potential, not reality. They see who someone could become if healed, self-aware, emotionally mature. And they keep investing in that future version of the person while ignoring who the person repeatedly shows themselves to be in the present. That hope becomes emotionally addictive, because every small moment of affection feels like proof the relationship can still work. A good conversation, a loving text, temporary effort. It gives the empath just enough emotional fuel to stay longer. But temporary effort cannot heal consistent emotional neglect. And eventually, the empath becomes tired of surviving on emotional breadcrumbs. That's when the emotional switch flips. It's subtle at first. They stop arguing, stop defending themselves, stop trying to prove their worth, and that silence gets misunderstood. The other person thinks, maybe things are finally calm, but emotionally, the empath has already started leaving. See, when empaths stop fighting for the relationship, that's not peace. That's surrender. They've realized their emotional energy is no longer safe in that environment. So they begin emotionally withdrawing piece by piece, less vulnerability, less attachment, less emotional investment, until one day they're completely gone. And the terrifying part? Most people don't even notice the moment it happened, because emotional disconnection happens gradually. A delayed reply here, a forced smile there. A conversation that feels emptier than usual. Tiny emotional fractures slowly becoming permanent distance. There's also something else people misunderstand about empaths. Just because they're compassionate doesn't mean they can tolerate endless emotional damage. In fact, highly empathetic people often reach a point where they become emotionally numb toward the person who hurt them. Not because they stopped caring instantly, but because their mind had to protect itself. Psychologists call this emotional shutdown. When someone experiences repeated emotional pain without resolution, the brain eventually reduces emotional responsiveness as a survival mechanism. It's the nervous system saying, enough. That's why an empath who once cried over you can eventually feel nothing at all. And that emotional numbness shocks people more than anger ever could, because they expect the empath to always stay soft, always stay available, always stay understanding. But empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction, and mature empaths eventually learn that lesson the hard way. They realize love should not require abandoning themselves emotionally. They realize constant anxiety is not passion, confusion is not connection, emotional instability is not love. And once they learn those lessons deeply, they become extremely difficult to manipulate again. That's why their disappearance feels so final. Because the version of them willing to tolerate emotional neglect no longer exists. One of the saddest realities is that empaths usually communicate their pain long before leaving, but they do it gently, indirectly, calmly. They hint at emotional exhaustion. They ask for reassurance. They try to explain their emotional needs without sounding demanding. But when those needs repeatedly get minimized, ignored, or mocked, they stop speaking altogether. Silence becomes self-protection. And silence is dangerous in relationships because people often mistake it for acceptance. It's not acceptance, it's emotional resignation. The empath has stopped believing change is possible. That's why some people wake up one day completely blindsided when the empath leaves. They say things like, everything seemed fine. Why didn't you tell me? You should have communicated more. But the truth is usually painful. The empath did communicate, repeatedly. They just stopped when they realized their feelings only mattered temporarily. And temporary attention can't heal chronic emotional neglect. This is where human psychology becomes brutal. People tend to value emotional security the most after it disappears. While they have it, they norma, Uranus. They assume the empath will always understand, always forgive, always stay. But once that emotional safety vanishes, the nervous system panics. Now they miss the small things. The emotional warmth, the patience, the feeling of being deeply understood. But by then, the empath may already be emotionally gone forever. And here's what hurts the most. Empaths rarely stop loving immediately. Sometimes they leave while still loving the person deeply. Read that again carefully. They leave because love alone stopped being enough to survive the emotional pain. That's what makes their departure tragic. Not lack of love, but lack of emotional safety. You can love someone and still realize they are destroying your mental peace. And mature empaths eventually choose peace over attachment. That decision changes their entire life. Once they experience relationships where communication feels safe, where effort feels mutual, where emotional consistency exists, they begin realizing how unhealthy their previous dynamic actually was. And suddenly, going back feels impossible, because clarity destroys emotional illusions. The empath finally sees how much of the relationship depends, on their tolerance, patience, and emotional labor. Without their constant effort, the connection collapses on its own. That realization can be heartbreaking, especially for people who genuinely loved deeply. But love without emotional responsibility slowly becomes emotional harm. And empaths eventually learn they cannot heal people who refuse to heal themselves. That lesson is devastating because empaths naturally want to save others emotionally. They believe understanding someone deeply will eventually create change. But understanding someone's trauma does not excuse repeated emotional damage. At some point, compassion must include yourself too. And when that finally happens, the empath transforms. They stop chasing closure from people incapable of giving it. They stop explaining their worth. They stop begging for consistency. Instead, they quietly leave environments that drain them emotionally. That silence isn't weakness. It's wisdom learned through suffering. The people who experience this loss often describe it the same way. They say the empath became different, colder, detached, unreachable. But what actually happened is simpler. The empath got tired of arriving emotional weight alone. And once someone becomes emotionally exhausted enough, survival becomes more important than attachment. There's also a hidden danger in underestimating emotionally sensitive people, because while they may appear forgiving, they remember emotional patterns very clearly. Every dismissal, every broken promise, every moment they felt unseen. They may not react immediately, but emotionally, those moments accumulate, like invisible scars, and eventually the emotional burden becomes too heavy to ignore. That's why one final disappointment can suddenly end everything. Not because of that single moment alone, but because it reopened every unresolved wound beneath it. To the outside world, it seems sudden. To the empath, it was building for years. That's the psychological reality people rarely understand. No one emotionally disappears overnight. Disconnection is usually the final stage of prolonged emotional pain, and empaths are masters at hiding pain while still functioning normally. They'll comfort others while privately breaking down. They'll smile while emotionally drowning. They'll stay loyal while silently feeling alone. Until one day, the RB simply can't do it anymore. And when they finally choose themselves, the transformation becomes irreversible. Because self-respect changes relationship standards permanently. The empath who learns healthy boundaries becomes impossible to emotionally manipulate the same way again. They start paying attention to actions instead of words, consistency instead of promises, emotional effort instead of emotional excuses. And many people lose access to them because of that growth. Not because the empath became cruel, but because they finally stopped abandoning themselves for love. That's why emotionally mature empaths often become quieter over time, more selective, more protective of their energy. They understand that not everyone deserves unlimited emotional access to them. And honestly, they learned that lesson through pain. Pain taught them who only loved their light but ignored their wounds. Pain taught them who only valued them during loneliness. Pain taught them who confused emotional dependence with genuine love. After enough disappointment, the empath begins choosing relationships that feel calm instead of chaotic. Because chaos is exhausting for sensitive nervous system, or mistress. And this is something many people discover too late. An empath's silence is not empty. It's full of everything they stopped trying to explain, every ignored feeling, every dismissed emotion, every moment they swallowed pain to keep peace, all sitting quietly beneath the surface. So when they finally disappear, it's rarely impulsive. It's the result of emotional survival. And the most haunting part. Sometimes the empath genuinely wanted the relationship to work until the very end. They kept hoping for emotional consistency, kept hoping for accountability, kept hoping the person would finally understand their pain before it was too late. But hope cannot survive repeated emotional disappointment forever. Eventually reality wins, and reality says this: no matter how deeply someone loves you, if you repeatedly make them feel emotionally unsafe, emotionally unseen, or emotionally alone, one day they will stop reaching for you entirely. Not because they stopped caring, but because caring started hurting too much. And once an empath associates love with emotional suffering, their entire body begins craving distance instead of connection. That's when the disappearance becomes permanent. No dramatic ending, no hatred, no revenge, just a quiet decision to protect their peace at all costs. The saddest thing about losing an empath is that you usually don't realize their value until the emotional warmth they carried is gone. Their presence felt natural while they were there. Their understanding felt ordinary. Their patience felt endless. Until suddenly, life feels colder without them. Because genuine emotional depth is rare. Very rare. Most people know how to talk. Very few know how to truly understand another human being emotionally. Empaths do. That's why their absence leaves such a deep psychological impact, and maybe that's the real lesson here. The people who love quietly often break quietly too. Not every wound is loud, not every goodbye is dramatic. Sometimes the deepest emotional endings happen in silence. So if there's someone in your life who keeps showing up for you emotionally, someone who listens, understands, forgives, supports, and stays patient even during your worst moments, Don't assume they'll always be there no matter how you treat them, because even the softest hearts have limits. And once those limits are crossed, or Pia at times, they won't fight, argue, or beg anymore. They'll simply disappear into a version of life where they finally feel emotionally safe. And by the time you notice they're gone, it may already be forever. So tell me honestly, do you think people realize the value of an empath only after losing them, or do some people simply never understand what they had in the first place?